I would suggest to you there's at least two ways to get more peace and more confidence from God's promises. The first way, and it's fairly simple, it's keeping His promises in our mind. You see, as we go through our day-to-day life, we get busy doing the things we're doing. At work, we're thinking about the problems we're dealing with, we're thinking about the situations that annoy us, we're thinking about the difficulties, the problems we have to solve, and fairly often, we literally forget about God. We forget about His promises. We forget about the fact that He's promised to be with us and never forsake us, wherever we are. So the solution to that is relatively simple. Set up some way to remind ourselves about what God says, about God's promises. It could be as simple as taking out your cell phone, almost everybody has those smartphones, right? And programming in an alarm that goes off, 3 times a day or so. Morning, lunch, evening, something like that. And putting on there in your description for the alarm, remember God's promises. If you have a specific promise that was really meaningful for you at this particular time in your life, you might want to copy it right in there. It probably allows you at least a few word description for it. So that's the first way we can gain more peace and more confidence from God's promises. Just simply reminding ourselves of them, keeping them in our mind on a more consistent and constant basis. The second way is to move beyond the details of any particular promise that you've read in His Word, and to see the God who's made those promises, to understand His love for you, His power to change your life, to make it better. And as you discover that, and most likely, to be honest with you, it's going to take some actual life experience and time for this to occur, then you'll start to realize that even though He'll make a specific promise in one area, and there are times it feels like He's not actually keeping His promise. For example, God promised Abraham in the Bible to make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or all the grains of sand on the seashore. And God kept that promise about 1,000 years later. Now, that wasn't exactly the way we would think about God keeping His promise, but He remembered it, and He actually made it happen. Now, for you and me, learning that God is personally interested in us, learning that He loves us enough to actually die for us, to do anything it takes to make our eternal life completely secure, gives us an understanding that while He may not answer His promises exactly the way we want, exactly the way we think, He does have our best interest at heart. And when we recognize that, we can then develop this sense of trust that whatever happens in our life, no matter what the difficulties are, we know that our friend, our God, our Savior, has our back. And while He may not give us exactly what we're asking for right at this moment, while He may make a promise and it feels as though He's not keeping it at this particular moment, we develop this sense of trust, knowing that He does know best, and that He is working all things together for our good. Both the things that we recognize as good, as well as the things that feel really, really bad and painful. So, after thinking about this for a bit, I wanted to close this video out by using the story of Joseph as an illustration of how understanding the God behind those promises can give us so much greater peace and confidence in ourselves, in our life, and in our security. So, as you may know, Joseph, we kind of meet Joseph as a teenager or so, and he's the favorite son of a relatively wealthy man. But he's the next to the youngest son. In fact, for quite a while, he was the youngest son, and his older brothers, especially the oldest, would naturally have been the favored son in that particular culture. Because he was the son of his father's favorite wife, he had a special position, so much so that his father made him a coat of many colors. That was one favor that he passed on to Joseph. The only thing that the Bible records that might be considered a little bit wrong, and it wasn't really wrong, was the fact that Joseph had a couple of dreams, both of which made him appear as though he might end up being superior or more important than his brothers, and the second dream even perhaps more important than his father and mother. That's when the sun, moon, and 11 stars all bowed down to him. Even his father kind of laughed at it. But that's his only crime. But because he was his father's favorite, there was a great deal of jealousy. Now, you could imagine that Joseph was trying to do the right thing and was expecting to count on the fact that God would bless him. Because multiple promises in the Bible tell us either explicitly or implicitly that if we're following God and doing the right things, He will bless it. And yet, Joseph, following God, doing the right things, was rewarded by his brothers being so jealous, they threw him in a pit and actually wanted to kill him. If it weren't for the fact that the oldest brother decided that that would just create too much harm for their father, they would have killed him. So instead they end up selling him as a slave. And so his reward for being a good son, trying to do the right thing, was to be sold as a slave to foreigners going into a foreign country where he didn't know the language and had no idea how to function there. Once sold as a slave, you would think, well, perhaps you'd have a reason to give up on God, because God clearly had not been protecting him or doing him much good, right? But Joseph determined to follow God anyway, even though it looked as though God was, quite frankly, letting him down. He decided to work hard, he decided to be honest, he decided to do the best work he possibly could for his master, and over time he rose through the ranks of slaves to be the head slave. In fact, you might call him the general manager of all of Potiphar's entire business and household. The Bible indicates that Joseph was managing everything in Potiphar's household. Potiphar only paid attention to the food that was in front of him. And so you can see how Joseph choosing to do the right thing was in some ways rewarded. He was still a slave, but he was made a slave who was more or less in charge of his own life and certainly had far more freedoms and respect than the majority of slaves had. However, Potiphar's wife had designs on him and tried to seduce him. Joseph again chose to do the right thing. And if you listen to the way he words it, he says, I cannot sin against my master. I cannot sin against God and do this wickedness. That's his reasoning. And for choosing to do the right thing, she grabs his coat, he runs away, she screams rape, and he ends up in prison for choosing to do the right thing. Talk about unfair. Talk about a huge miscarriage of justice. If Joseph ever had a reason, if anyone ever had a reason for praying, God, why? Why me? Where are you at? I'm doing the right thing and you're punishing me. You're not just not protecting me, you're almost punishing me. Joseph would have had every reason to feel as though God had abandoned him and let him down. But again, instead of choosing to look at the outward circumstances and decide that all of God's promises were pointless or lies and giving up on God, he chose to believe the God behind those promises, that somehow or another God still must love him. And he chose to be a good prisoner. And again, he moved up through the ranks and he ended up working himself into being what I guess would be called today head porter. And he was like second underneath the warden in terms of taking care of all the prisoners. Now, of course, that didn't get him out of prison, but it did give him a little bit more freedom within the prison. And it gave him, better options while being in prison. Again, he's trying to do the right thing, even though it appears as though God's letting him down. Two prisoners come in who are directly working for the king, the butler and the baker. Joseph notes them and gets to be friends with them and notices them personally enough that he recognizes when they're both sad and upset. They tell him about two dreams they've had, and he says, you know what, I don't know how to interpret these, but I know the God who does. They tell him those dreams. He interprets them correctly. In the end, the baker is hanged, and the butler is restored back to his position with the king. And Joseph says, please, when you get to Pharaoh, please notify him of me. Let him know that I'm here. I've done absolutely nothing wrong. You can almost hear the despair in his voice. I've tried to do everything right, and here I am in prison for doing the right thing. Please help me. And then years go by. Yes, literally years. The butler doesn't remember his promise. And it isn't until Pharaoh has these dreams that he just doesn't understand and no one can seem to help him with, that the butler finally remembers, oh yeah, I met this guy in prison who knows how to interpret dreams. And Joseph gets called out of the prison, meets Pharaoh, and is then able to notify Pharaoh that God can give him the answer to these dreams. Joseph, in fact, gives Pharaoh the answer, or the interpretation of these dreams, the meaning of it, and then he makes a recommendation. And he basically, the dream meant that there was going to be 7 great years of plenty, lots of rain, lots of crops, just everything growing great. And then there was going to be 7 years of just terrible famine. And so Joseph's advice was simply store up all this food during the good years so that you can make it through the bad years. And Pharaoh and all of his people look around and go, wow, that's amazing advice. And they end up making Joseph the second highest ruler in all of Egypt so that he could accomplish this task. And here's the funny thing. Joseph, keeping faith that the God behind the promises was working for his good, all of those years thrown in a pit while he was trying to be a good son, sold as a slave while trying to do the right thing, thrown in prison for saying no to a sexual deviance, not deviance, but sexual affair, and not having anybody listen to him when he's going out of his way to interpret a dream for some fellow prisoners. All of those times where Joseph could have said, God, where are you? You've let me down. You haven't worked all things together for good. You have not given me prosperity when I followed you. And yet Joseph chose to believe that behind those promises was a God who wanted his ultimate good. And ultimately his reward, the second highest position in the most powerful nation on the planet. Not only from that position was he able to save most of Egypt, but the food that he stored up also saved his father and all of his brothers and his brothers' families. But the story gets even bigger than that. The blessing, the honor of Joseph gets even bigger than that. Because his great-grandfather, Abraham, was given a promise by God, we mentioned that earlier in this video, that he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars of the sea. But he also made a specific promise that one descendant, a singular descendant, would bless the entire earth. That was a reference to Christ himself. So in effect, Joseph was tasked and given the honor and the ability to save the human lineage of Christ himself, because he chose to believe the God behind the promises, despite the appearance that God was not keeping his word. So that is how we can have such deeper, stronger faith and confidence and peace in our life through God's promises. Don't look at just the individual promise and the things that he promises. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will work all things together for your good. And that, if you look at Joseph's life, is totally true. While he had all kinds of troubles, in many ways, God was playing what I call galactic chess and moving Joseph strategically from one place to another, from out of his homeland, being sold as a slave, moved to Egypt, into a prison, getting in contact with Pharaoh, and finally in a position to do this miraculous saving of his own family and then the human lineage of Christ itself. What an amazing honor, and all because he chose to trust God despite what appeared to be evidence that God was not trustworthy. I suggest to you, I recommend to you, that you look not just at God's promises, but at the God behind those promises. And when you can truly believe that on a heartfelt level, you will have peace, you will have confidence, you will have ease in your life like virtually nothing else can give you. Have a blessed day.